All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the first webinar of 2025 for our Oregon Beaches Forever webinar series. Tonight, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Meagan Wengrove. But first, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Surfrider and the Oregon Beaches Forever campaign. And my name is Kaya Hazard. I'm Surfrider's Oregon Regional Manager. And Surfrider, we're a nonprofit group working in coastal states nationwide, and we work on many different initiatives across many areas to protect our ocean and coastline. But in Oregon, these range from monitoring water quality, protecting special places like marine reserves and rocky habitat. We're fighting against plastic pollution through beach cleanups and progressive policy. And we are making sure that Oregon's public beach remains accessible. So to that end, Surfrider has teamed up with Oregon Shores to launch our new campaign, Oregon Beaches Forever. As you may know, Oregon's beaches are threatened by the coastal squeeze between coastal development and the armoring built to protect it on one side, and on the other by sea level rise, climate change, and intensifying storms. So through this new campaign, we will be taking a more holistic approach to protecting our beaches. We're going to continue to oppose shoreline armoring along our coasts as we know the harmful effects that it has on our public beaches, but we'll also be advocating at the local level for climate adaptation and improved shoreline management, like through the current update through the Clatsop Comprehensive Plan. We'll also be working to implement nature-based solution model projects and policies that promote beach preservation and climate adaptation. And we'll be working both with Oregon State Parks and the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which are the agencies that manage the shoreline, on their rulemaking processes to update and improve existing regulations for shoreline armoring, permitting, and access to and along the shoreline. So if you would like to learn more about this campaign and stay up to date with upcoming educational events like this one, you can find more information on both Surfrider and Oregon Shores on our websites, and I will drop that link into the chat. And I'll also ask that if folks have questions, please drop those into the chat or into the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end. So with that, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Meagan Wengrove. Meagan is an associate professor at Oregon State University in coastal engineering. One of her research themes is focused around nature-based solutions for coastal protection, specifically applicable to the high energy shorelines of the Pacific Northwest coast. She and her research group do a mix of field lab and numerical modeling work focused around nature-based solutions. Meagan has been at OSU for 6.5 years, and before that, she did her PhD at the University of New Hampshire and was a Fulbright graduate scholar in the Netherlands, where she also worked with nature-based features. Meagan leads the Coastal Boundary Dynamics Research Group, which has a mix of graduate students, postdocs, and undergraduate students, and research associates. So thank you, Meagan, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kaya. Really appreciate it. Excited to hear from you all and answer whatever questions you have. So yeah, I adopted the title that Kaya and I kind of workshop together, combating erosion with nature-based designs, and I'm going to go through a few of the different designs, but focus a lot on one that we've been thinking about as a viable option for the Pacific Northwest coast. Obviously, with all these designs, you will have to think about the place that you're in and whether it's suitable for those conditions and that environment. So there's no one solution fits all. So before I jump in, I also wanted to just give a shout out to the Cascadia COPES Hub, which stands for the Cascadia Coastlines and Peoples Hub. This is a group funded by the National Science Foundation that I'm a part of, and we think about how different communities in the Pacific Northwest can prepare and adapt to coastal hazards. And so one of the themes in there that we're working on is these nature-based features. And we do have some capacity to help communities think through some of the issues that they might be having. So I encourage you to go visit the website if you are interested. So additionally, all the work that is presented through this talk was not done in isolation. We have a lot of different students who've worked on this work at Oregon State, as well as partners through Oregon and Washington that have really been key to making sure that this work moves forward and also is applicable to communities that really need it. So um, lots of folks involved here. And then also our funders, we've gotten some funding from Oregon Sea Grant. They're a big supporter of nature-based work, as well as the U.S. Coastal Research Program, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the National Science Foundation. So I just wanted to start with this graphic here, which is up in Washington, but we have similar stories on the Oregon coast too. We just were fortunate to work with a landscape architect who could make these beautiful drawings, and I have a few of them featured throughout the presentation. This is near North Cove, Washington. North Cove is kind of right in the middle of the area, and this is an area that was referred to as Washaway Beach. So they lost tons of land. You can see the years. I wonder if I can do a pointer. Laser. Oh, there we go. Laser pointer. Okay. So we can see the years on the coastline, the shoreline. So 1911, the spit was pretty far out into the Willapa Bay. So the Willapa Bay is just south of this shoreline here, and then there was progressive erosion 1945, 1955, 1970, houses falling into the ocean. So pretty catastrophic. And most recently, there's been a bunch of homes and livelihoods that have needed some kind of protection against this uh, chronic erosion problem, and they chose a nature-based feature. So I'll highlight some of that through the talk. So what we're trying to do is, you know, change the story from these shorelines that are really in a chronic state of erosion to something that's a little bit more sustainable. And sometimes that means that the shoreline will build out again with time, which is great. Other times it might mean that the nature-based solution can buy the community some more time to adapt and potentially move some of the critical assets they have there. So there's different goals to the projects depending on the place. This is also from the same area. Someone lost their home into the ocean. So typically what we've seen in a lot of places around the US and also in Oregon is is trying to mitigate, to stop, not really mitigate, but stop coastal erosion with hard armoring solutions. So that can look like seawalls in some places. In Oregon, it often looks like riprap. Probably some of you have been to Nescoin or Rockaway Beach and have seen this riprap armoring on the coast. This armoring can make its own erosion problems at the edges. So if we look at this Rockaway picture here, they had to kind of surround this RV park with riprap because the shoreline kept on progressively eroding at the edges. And so it can create its own problems. And what we're trying to do with nature-based features is try to keep the sand in the system, which is what we really need to buffer against big storm events. So one nature-based solution that we are pretty familiar with are the coastal dunes. Not everything is known about these dunes, but they've been around, for a long time, and we know that they can help buffer erosion during big storm events. So I'm going to start with the dunes and just get us introduced into the nature-based mindset, and then I'll move to some of the other features that we've thought about. So These are different dune archetypes that all exist in the Pacific Northwest. And when we look at these systems, we think about how do we characterize them? What are their management goals? What are the ecosystem services? And what is their perceived risk to overtopping? So this is a slide that I use in one of my classes, but I like to see that there's all these different ways we can think about dunes all within just two states of coastal length. So the first one we have here, these are dunes in Pacific City. And these dunes are graded for views. So the homeowners want to be able to see the ocean and they grade the dunes down. There's the ecosystem services associated with these dunes are some level of protection against wave impact, not grading it down to the beach level. But there is some moderate risk to overtopping because the elevation is being lowered. The second dunes we have here are highly vegetated dunes, so lots of grasses. These are actually invasive beach grasses, and there's a whole nother presentation that one of my colleagues, Sally Hacker, could give about how the grasses came to be in Oregon. But they are prolific, these grasses, and uh, they build these very tall coastal dunes. And the management goal for these dunes today is coastal protection and then also reducing inundation from wind blowing sand. And they do provide habitat to some species. Um, and then they also have um, a very low risk to overtopping because they grow so tall from those grasses. Then the third picture I have here, number C, is a dune that was constructed in front of these condos here. So this is a built dune on the Oregon coast that was revegetated with grasses. And so in this case, the purpose of the dune is to protect the coast and provide some habitat. And it's not a very tall dune, but it could grow tall eventually, so its risk to overtopping might be moderate. And then the D dune, this is another graded dune, but for a very different purpose. So this dune was graded for plover habitat, which I think most of us probably know is an endangered bird that's on our coast, and they like these open sandy systems. So while the risk to overtopping and the goal is moderate, the goal is not coastal protection. These graded dunes are in areas where there aren't really any buildings or anything to protect, so it's really just to maintain this habitat. And then the last dune I have here actually has sand fences on top of it, which are there to trap sand, so to help the dune grow taller. And this was also a constructed dune that is being used for coastal protection. But they're also trying to keep it bare of invasive grasses so that it can provide some habitat to the snowy plover. So we often think about dunes as something that's just part of the coast, and they are a feature that's part of the coast, but they also can provide us protection against erosion and other ecosystem services. And we have seen in the Pacific Northwest, we've built them or rebuilt them in areas where there has been some erosion, and we're looking to buffer erosion into the future. So that's one nature-based feature that can be used and adopted in the Pacific Northwest. The next one I'm going to talk to you all about is composite beaches. So composite beaches are natural features where you have a sandy foreshore and a cobble backshore. And some beaches in Oregon that are composite beaches are like Arch Cape and Falcon Cove. There's actually a lot of them along the coast. And so these are a natural feature. And so with these nature-based designs, we're trying to mimic nature and focus towards prompted recovery where we can replicate this natural feature to reduce erosion. So what that looks like is a beach profile that maybe had some cobble existing somewhere nearby, which there are many in the Pacific Northwest. And cobble is artificially placed to mimic a composite beach and provide some protection against high wave energy events. So a design for a dynamic revetment, or dynamic cobble berm revetment, which is the engineered analog of a composite beach, is it has some crest elevation that would be designed based upon how high the water levels will get during some of the bigger storm events. Has some slope, but we've seen the slope adjust to the wave conditions pretty quickly on these. And it also has a volume that is needed to maintain the cobble, um, the cobble matrix through several different storm events. And one of the biggest features of these dynamic revetments is that the cobbles are meant to move and roll around. We're not looking to create a fixed feature like a riprap coastline. We want these cobbles to move because as they move, they're dissipating some of that wave energy that's running up onto the cobble. And they are also, when the wave's running back down, it's infiltrating through the cobble, losing more energy. And through that process, it's buffering the sand underneath and behind it from excess erosion. So this is a time-lapse video from an experiment that we did, a 1 to 12 experiment we did in a wave lab down in Mississippi, joint with the Army Corps. And so it's just a really nice way to see how a dynamic revetment might evolve through space and time. So I'll play it one more time. So these pictures are taken every, I think, 30 seconds or 1 minute. And we can see that as the storm events are hitting the dynamic revetment, it's retreating backwards, but it's also growing taller, and it's not really losing sand underneath it or behind it. So we worked with that same landscape architect up in Washington to create these set of drawings, and there's a bunch of them. If you're interested in these drawings, they're publicly available, and I can provide the website for that. But the idea of the dynamic revetment is that you have some, like maybe bluff or eroding shoreline that's not in a stable state. And then if we add cobbled and woody debris to the system, the cobbles and the wood can trap sand over time. And then eventually it starts to fill in with sand, and there's in the summertime, there's not very much cobble exposed, and in the wintertime, you may have some cobble exposed. But overall, instead of the shoreline retreating, it is it's potentially even possibly growing with time. It really depends on the sand supplied to the system, but we have seen in a few areas where these eroding shorelines have changed direction, started becoming accretional shorelines, or where they just have not eroded at the same rate that they were eroding before. So I think my next few slides here are examples of different dynamic revetments that already exist in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm just going to go through like why they were designed and um, who built them, and then what the status of them are today. And this, I think, really gives you a good feeling for different types of projects that could fit into various coastal systems that we have here in Oregon that might be eroding. So the first one, I'm going to go from south to north. So the first one is Cape Lookout. Cape Lookout has a campground, maybe some of you are familiar with, and fronting that campground, there is a dynamic revetment. So this dynamic revetment was constructed by the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department back in about 24 years ago, and also OSU was involved at that time as well. And it was built to mitigate erosion in front of the state park and has since then had very little amount of maintenance. Before it was built, there were some bathrooms and things that had um, eroded and needed to be removed because of the amount of erosion rate that they've had. But since then, with very little maintenance, it's only really seen 10 meters of retreat in the last 24 years. So it really has been a successful project, and there's ideas right now about how to um, re-nourish this dynamic revetment to make it more resilient to future storms. There's just not enough cobble left there without maintaining it to buffer the big wave energy events at this time. But this is like a pretty good, pretty long-term successful project that we have here in Oregon. The next one here is the South Jetty of the Columbia River. This is a very different scale dynamic revetment, and it was built in 2013, and it was constructed by the Army Corps joint with Dogami, and it was built to protect the jetty, the South Jetty of the Columbia River, from breaching. And it's had some maintenance, and over time, a dune has naturally built over top of it. So this profile that I'm showing here, the dashed line here is where the dynamic revetment was placed initially, and the thin solid line shows what the dune looks like now, or I guess in 2022 that's built over top of the dynamic revetment. And so on the x-axis, we have distance in the cross shore, and the y-axis is elevation. So we're seeing this dune that's really built on top of this dynamic revetment. And what that looks like, here's some photos of the performance of this dynamic revetment over time. So in 2020, you couldn't even see the cobbles anymore. Remember, this was placed in 2013. So the picture of the placement is, whoops, wrong way, is here. So it looked like a big cobble berm. Um, and then in 2021, there was a big storm, and the dune was eroded, but the cobble was underneath, so wasn't eroded all the way. And then January 2022, cobble still exposed, but by October 2022, sand was mostly covering the dynamic revetment again, and it's all um, been a community of the beach grass has grown on top of the dynamic revetment. So our next project is North Cove, Washington, and North Cove is up the project that I was showing you with those beautiful drawings. That's the location of those drawings. And so this project was built in two sections right around this person's property, where they actually armored their property with riprap to protect that property from erosion. But you can see armoring with riprap left the sides of that area still vulnerable to erosion. So there's a bunch of cranberry bog farms behind this area, and so this community just really felt empowered that they needed to change their story and keep their livelihood. So this is the coastline that was called Washaway Beach, and you'll see some of the stakeholders, champions there. They have shirts and jackets and hats that say "Wash away no more" on them. So it's a great story, and they've started to see their coastline actually build out in time. And this was really a grassroots effort. So they just placed cobbles and wood and whatever they could really get their hands on to try to reduce this erosion. And they're still working on it, and have gotten a new grant to continue this project. And then the next one here is Empire Spit, Washington. This dynamic revetment fronts a tribe, and so it was constructed jointly between the Shoalwater Bay Indian tribe and designed by the Army Corps. And so It was actually placed on a barrier spit that's protecting a marsh. And then finally the homes and casinos and things behind that. So they really thought pretty far in advance. They wanted to keep their marsh, and so they're trying to maintain this basically barrier island that they have here. This is a really huge dynamic revetment as well, and it hasn't seen as many storms yet. It was built in 2022. And then so that's the dashed line, and then the profile in 2023 is this solid lines. We see some mobility, but it hasn't changed a lot yet. And then the final project I'll show is really a smaller scale project, and it was completely paid for by these condo owners up in Westport, Washington, who wanted to protect their condos. And so it was built with a sand dune behind it and had a pretty short design life with the expectation that they would have to maintain it over time. And it was constructed in 2022, and so far it's held pretty steady. So if we just compare some of these dynamic revetments side by side, we can look at things like their design life and their elevation and the amount of cobble that they placed, as well as the expected maintenance interval. And so these are the three of the ones that I showed you: Westport, Washington in front of the condos, Empire Spit in front of the Shoalwater Bay tribe, and South Jetty, Oregon in front of the South Jetty in the Columbia River. And we can see that the Army Corps projects were designed for much longer design lives, 20 to 50 years. And than the Westport revetment, that was only for a design life of 5 years. And the two Army Corps projects placed a lot more cobble, so almost 100 cubic meters per meter of shoreline of cobble, while the Westport one was about a third of that. And then the expected maintenance interval built into the design was variable based upon the amount of cobble out there. So really these projects can be built to scale to help a community or whoever's trying to construct it keep on track with maintenance intervals that they feel comfortable with, as well as costs that are reasonable for them. So with all that information, our group has really been trying to think about what the missing steps are. So while I showed you an outline for what a dynamic revetment design would look like, we really have not too great of understanding about each of those individual parameters of what would go into a design. So one of our first needs that was outlined is um, an updated science-based guidance document for dynamic revetment design practices. So this is a document whose audience would be coastal engineers and geomorphologists and policymakers and planners and regulators who might be thinking about different nature-based options for mitigating coastal erosion. And the purpose is to communicate the best available science out there today and also kind of highlight existing gaps in knowledge. And then our lab group is working on filling some of those gaps. So this document, as well as a lot of our research, really focuses on engaged research. So that means that we've been trying to embed stakeholders and various perspectives across the project life cycle, from the very beginning to the implementation of the project. And a lot of these nature-based features are following that same approach. So they are engaging the different stakeholders early and upfront, and that has made the projects that have done that pretty successful. So the state of the practice paper that is addressing that gap in knowledge that I presented on this slide here was led by Haley Bond, who's a PhD student working with me, and it has a few different sections. So we started out by just a practitioner survey where we sent this survey to engineers and planners and policymakers around the Pacific Northwest, and some folks responded from California as well as even other countries, just to assess where we're at and what our present needs are. And so from that survey, we found that existing design tools um, are lacking for dynamic revetments. So this paper goes through what tools are already out there and the confidence that we might have in each of those tools for designing a dynamic cobble berm revetment. It also goes through those existing projects that I shared with you. And finally, it suggests a design process for how one might go about thinking about how to design a dynamic revetment using the existing design tools. And then our plan is to try to address some of the gaps in knowledge, or as many as we can, with creating a better way of designing dynamic revetments that fit the Oregon and Washington coastlines. So just to go through some of the gaps in engineering and management knowledge that we know about, the first set is focused on the geometry. So like, what should the front slope be? What should the crest width be? How high should it be? And what should the cobble volume be? So we've done some lab experiments, the time-lapse video that I showed you that will help us address the volume question, as well as some of the other geometry questions. We also don't really have a great idea of what the cobble size and shape should be, and most of the projects have gone to nature and just looked to see what's out there on natural composite beaches and mimicked that in the dynamic revetments, which we feel is a pretty good process, but we're trying to quantify how the cobbles move along shore and how they might be lost, and if an angular cobble is as good as a rounded cobble, where you find rounded cobbles naturally on composite beaches, but if you want to place those, it's super expensive because you have to find them from riverbeds. So could we use angular cobbles instead of rounded cobbles? And are there any downsides to that? We're also looking at the influence of sand infilling. So our hope is that sand will come back into the system, and we like sand, but the sand also might influence the mobility of the dynamic revetment. And so we're looking into that. We're also thinking about the ecology that's existing on these dynamic revetments, and if there's any plus sides or minus sides to placing a dynamic revetment on a coastline that didn't initially have cobble. How are we changing the habitat there? And then also how these things evolve in the future and what the end effects might be. And then what's the best way to construct them? How often do they need to be maintained? And then, yeah, what design period should we focus on? Should we focus on a storm event that happens 1% of the time, or a storm event that happens 0.1% of the time? What's the best design condition? So I'm going to go through just some different areas that we're currently working on. So one is to predict run-up onto composite beaches. So most of the equations that have been used for run-up of waves onto beaches were made for either sandy beaches or cobble beaches. And there's there's a kind of a gap in knowledge for this run up that goes from a sandy beach onto a cobble beach. So we have Andrew here who's looking at a bunch of video data and quantifying run up onto these composite beaches. And he'll use that to implement into a stochastic framework so we can consider how dynamic revetments might evolve into the future. Then we have Haley again. Haley's done a lot of different contributions, made a lot of different contributions to this work. And one of them that she's really thinking about right now is tracking these cobbles, individual cobbles, as they move along the coast. And the idea is that we don't know how much these cobbles move in the alongshore. There's not great equations for that, and we think that a lot of the cobble loss for composite beaches or dynamic revetments is to a longshore motion. So she put RFID tags, like little radio tags, into these rocks, and she placed 100 of them on 3 different beaches. And so the plot at the top here is showing the different shoreline positions for when she monitored, or the cobble toe, so like how low the cobble extends onto the beach. And then the points are showing how far those cobbles moved from their initial position. So we can see for that survey, so we can see that they were all placed around this cluster of cobbles, and some of them moved about 250 meters in the alongshore in just um, like 3 months of time. So she's trying to come up with a way to quantify things like run-up elevation, which is this bottom plot here is showing time on the x-axis, and then the distance of the cobble traveled on the y-axis, which are the dots. So we can see that the cobbles moved pretty far for these different surveys. And then on the secondary axis, we can see how many times those cobbles have been impacted by a run-up event. So this blue line is showing us that over time there's been a lot more run-up events, and then the cobbles have moved further. So she's trying to come up with a way to quantify this in like a design framework. And then we have Colin Arnawill, who is working on characterizing grain size on composite beaches and looking at the variability in the cross shore and the alongshore, as well as during time, as well. And he's also looking at how angular or platy the cobbles are and what that might mean for their size variability. And this will give us a better idea for how these composite beaches move naturally, and help us think about the engineered analog dynamic revetments. And Louisa is working on quantifying the ecology of natural composite beaches. So she's actually just kind of designing her project right now, and she's already visited all these different points up in Oregon and Washington. And all these points are composite beaches or dynamic revetments that exist along the coast. And I think there's a few more that might not even be on this map yet. She's going to these sites and surveying what type of vegetation exists on the sites. And then we're working with some folks up in Washington who are looking at clams and other uh, like bugs and things. Obviously, you can see I'm not an ecologist, that exist in the intertidal area, and how those are important for shorebird feeding and things like that. So how are these composite beaches and dynamic revetments influencing the environment? And then finally, we have Krista, who has recently moved back to the Netherlands, and she has been looking at wind-blown sediment transport into dynamic revetments, and how that might change the infilling of the dynamic revetment. And then, like I said, we worked in the lab in Mississippi, and you can see this line of sand here is the dynamic revetment filling in from marine-driven sediment transport. And we can see preliminarily that as the dynamic revetment fills with sand, the overtopping rate changes. So there's not as much infiltration potential with a sand-filled cobble matrix. And so you have more waves that can overtop the whole dynamic revetment. But there is a trade-off. We really want that sand to be around as well. So these are, again, just the different gaps in knowledge, and our group is focusing on some of the ecology, geometry, the sand infilling, cobble shape, and then the hydrodynamics are run up onto these features. And we have, yeah, a lot of more exciting things to come out in the future. And I think Haley might be giving one of these talks later this fall to share some more of her exciting results. So the final feature that I just wanted to highlight, and I only have this one slide, is uh, woody debris. So we have a lot of large wood in the Pacific Northwest. If I think many of us have noticed that by just going out to the coast. And there's been thoughts about how we can use it for trapping sand. So we recently got to visit this site up on the north side of the Columbia River mouth where they had an erosion issue and the shoreline was back where these tall trees were. And so they built this feature out of fallen trees. These are all the root wads from the trees, and then the trees kind of extend landward, and they pinned them with these tall trees that are coming out of the sand, and their shoreline has accreted all the way back, all the way up to this point here. This was placed in 2016, and the picture was taken in 2024, and they feel like it's a big success. There was also a little girl jumping and running around in the logs, and they said no little humans would be running around on riprap without cuts and scrapes on their knees. So they were pretty excited about that as well. We know from other research that woody debris does trap sand, and the idea of these features is that they can buffer, uh, the wave energy. I think this is a video. Yeah, they can buffer the wave energy. So these root wads aren't placed quite close enough together, but the idea is that when um, these bores roll into the coast, they break on the root wad instead of on the shore behind and reduce some of the erosion that way. And that is all that I have for you guys. So I thank you so much for taking the time and listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If anyone has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or put it in the Q&A box. Or if you would like to ask your question directly to Meagan, go ahead and raise your hand and I will give you speaking powers. I have a question
Yeah.
to start us off. Do you know of any places in Oregon that are kind of being experimental in the way that they are at Washaway Beach?
So I think that there's a few places that are interested in being experimental, like the Cannon Beach area. I've heard some interest, as well as I recently heard from the one of the managers in Lincoln City who is trying to think about their beach accesses and how they could maintain them more naturally and are interested in some experimental approaches. And like the Cape Lookout project, which John Allen at Dogami was uh, helped design and still monitors to this day, was an experimental project back in that time. So there is a history of communities wanting to be experimental. I don't think at this time they are as like experimental as the communities in Washington, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't be.
Is there, what is the permitting landscape in Washington that allows for like the community at Washaway Beach to kind of try different things?
Yeah, it's a good question. So they have placed all their cobble above the high tide line. And so it's basically on their land. Um, yeah, so they haven't really had to get a bunch of permits for that.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Oh, we have a question in the Q&A box. What were the wave energy conditions for these sites?
Yeah, that's a good question. Uh, so I guess if I go back to the map, probably could have done this a different way, but too late. So this map here, these stars are showing where these sites are located. So um, the Cape Lookout site is on the outer coast, so they get the huge waves that we see come to the Oregon and Washington shore, which can be up to, 20 feet or more. And then the Westport dynamic revetment is the same on the outer coast. And then the Shoalwater Bay and the North Cove, as well as the South Jetty ones, are inside of the inlet, but they still see fairly large waves from certain directions. Like they're not very far into the inlet. So they might not see all the different directions, but they see pretty big waves uh, too.
John, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hey Megan, great presentation. It's really cool to see some of the science that's going on to evaluate sort of different elements of dynamic revetments, and that's really neat to see that all those different aspects. One of the one of the comments I'd make about dynamic revetments is that we need to be aware of course, is that it's it's a viable option in certain areas for certain conditions. And I think it still remains somewhat, untried, untested, maybe other than the Cape Lookout example, which obviously has been around for a long time. But, two comments that I would just note. One is that, many of these sites that have been built of late have really probably not been truly tested under the more extreme wave conditions that we have experienced in the past, particularly in the late 1990s. A lot of our storminess has been very mild in the last 15 years. And so, it's still to be determined how they will perform under those conditions. But certainly, obviously the examples you've shown from Cape Cove and Arch Cape and so on, these are areas with existing gravel beaches, they're natural, and they've been subject to these extreme storms in the past, and they performed very well, at least in a natural environment. So I think, just things to think about going forward into the future is just they still need to be tested. The second comment I'd make is just some of these sites, and maybe something for you to think about, maybe you can comment on, is concerns over flanking. In the case of the South Jetty site, that particular dynamic revetment has really come under sustained attack in the last 2 years. And it is likely to be flanked through a breaching of the natural foredune to the south of the structure. And so that could have implications on its longer term viability. Can you comment on maybe more how engineers have to sort of deal with these types of challenges, and what could be done maybe to address things like that at other sites?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think your first comment totally agree with. We don't know everything about these. They're still, yeah, like fairly early days, and you're right, they haven't seen the same tests as Cape Lookout has. And also I also want to say I don't want to see like our entire coastline become cobble. I think many of us wouldn't want to see that. So we have to think about where they're most suitable to. And then yeah, I think you know much more about the South Jetty breaching than I do, but I have looked a lot at this. It hasn't breached yet, but the flanking issue. I have looked at this Westport by the Sea dynamic revetment, and they have had some issues at the like edge effects um, because it's fairly short and they didn't have a lot of space to make it taper off into these other areas. There's a state park to the north and just other private homeowners to the south. And so they really only put it in front of their property. There hasn't really been extra excess erosion per se on the sides, but the dynamic revetment of the beach, but the dynamic revetment itself has seen some issues with just exposure of the inner core on the edges. So I think that tapering these off is something that should be thought about and really something that hasn't been considered in the research community yet, and we're just kind of watching it play out on the coast. Did that answer what?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. No, that answers my question. I mean, it's one of these areas that obviously, same with harder engineering structures, as you know, there's always that concern about end effects as well. While I don't think end effects per se from dynamic revetments are driving a lot of the changes, at least the sites that I've seen, ensuring that we're accommodating for the potential for that in our designs is obviously critically important, along the coast.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess another point is on the community side, like this area to the north of Westport is a state park, and the the condos, like during their design process, maybe could have done a little bit more outreach to the state park and the state parks folks, and like to make sure everyone came along for the ride. So I think that is a really important piece as well for all these coastal protection options, is that your neighbors also matter. So that's another edge effect.
And what was the length of this revetment in Westport?
Yeah, this one was about 200 meters long.
All right. So Barry wants to know if you have an opinion on the downsides of hard armoring, such as riprap on the beach, compared to a more dynamic approach.
Yeah, I should have put some figures in here with there's like a really good paper that shows how armoring can influence the beach. But basically what we see is that if you have a big hard rock that's not meant to move, then everything around it has to move instead. So if you're trying to put rock next to sand, then when these waves come and hit the rock, it's going to transfer a lot of that energy to going around this rock, and the sand moves pretty easily. So it can be scoured out from under the rock or create like a big pocket at the toe of the riprap. And then the edge effects can be pretty intense, like we see with this person's house here, where they armored pretty heavily around their home, and we see that the shoreline still retreated quite a bit on the edges. So it's really just that the rock's not meant to move and sand is going to move. So if you have a more dynamic option, like uh, working with nature, doesn't have to be cobble, but if it's more sand or maybe the wood, the idea is that it's going to reduce the wave energy instead of just trying to stop it, which will slow the waves down and not cause as much erosion, or even in some cases cause accretion of the sand instead.
Megan Walls has a question. My fear with Cobble Beach is that the cobbles would mobilize in the high energy water and hit the nearby infrastructure. The beaches in my region are small and infrastructure is very close. It seems like you need a large cross shore for this to work. What's your experience with narrower shorelines?
It's a good question. Well, if we look at some beach like Arch Cape, Oregon, they have, I've seen the beach with a pretty narrow beach at times. And there are houses right behind that natural composite beach. I think this is a picture here of Arch Cape. Um, and they have, to my knowledge, not seen damage from the rocks, but we do know that the rocks can be thrown. I don't know, John might have more anecdotal stories. I don't know. John, do you know if there's been rock damage?
So yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, in the example you've shown here by Arch Cape, the potential for damage from ballistics from cobble being moved around is pretty minimal in the scheme of things, other than at the very south end of Arch Cape where the back shore is really low lying. Most of the shoreline is backed by low bluffs that are, obviously provide some protection for cobble being, transported inland. So that provides a natural barrier. But there have been cases. I mean, the best example is actually Cape Lookout State Park, where storms in the late 1990s actually blew through into the park about a few hundred feet well into the park, and there are photos of pockmarks in the base of trees 2 to 3 feet above the ground where cobble actually was impacting the trees at the time, and a real testament to the velocities of the currents at the time carrying large cobbles into that area. But the reason for that was largely because the dune had blown through, and so there was no sort of barrier to stop the cobble movement. So wherever there's barriers, then the chance of ballistics happening from cobbles is probably pretty low. But as soon as you start losing that protective barrier, then conditions change rapidly.
Yeah, thank you. I knew you might have some other historical information, so thanks, John.
Julia has a comment about the mile that she monitors south of South Beach Park. She's saying that usually she sees wood pieces tossed around in a pile, but last time she was there, there was a fence of large pieces layered horizontally, which had to be man-made. So I guess, do you see a lot of people kind of taking it into their own hands to construct rogue, unpermitted
Uh,
projects?
yeah, that's a good question. I have seen fences of woody debris made in other places, but not necessarily rogue. I'm curious if it looked like they were making it for like a protection or if they were just playing around, because I've seen a lot of, can people moving woody debris around just to make forts and things as well, which I guess is fun.
Diana wants to know if you could speak to the downsides of hard armoring for wildlife habitat on the beach and public access and safety.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are some studies showing that like riprap rock or concrete doesn't does not host very many habitats. And because not always, but in a lot of places, we see the beach width reducing when you place these harder structures. Um, there's not as much space on the beach for the intertidal habitats to occur either. Um, One thing that we are planning on doing with the ecological monitoring of the composite beaches and the dynamic revetments is including some riprap areas into that work as well, so that we can compare to what like the vegetation is like on these riprap structures in comparison to the dynamic revetments and composite beaches. So I think there'll be more information that comes out from that perspective. And then safety wise, this is all, I guess, like anecdotal from my side, but just people saying like that if you have kids or whatever climbing on riprap that they're worried about them, falling or scraping their knees or whatever it is. But I would say cobble beaches and woody and large wood can also be pretty slippery when it's wet. So I'm not sure. The beach is just a place you should be careful at, I think. Just be aware of your surroundings no matter what. So I don't know. I think that's all I'll say about the safety side.
Well said. Someone who would prefer to remain anonymous has an anecdote about the rocks flying. They said that the rocks hit the roof of their house on Crescent Cove in Depot Bay.
Oh, wow. That must have been a big storm.
Yeah. Saying that to your point of a hard barrier makes the other stuff move. There's a concrete seawall with a cobble beach sometimes in the cove. When it's not a cobble beach, it is hard scoured with some resilient seaweed. Kind of a good anecdote right in their backyard.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. 7:01. Does anyone else have a question they would like to ask Meagan? All right. I think we will call it for the night. Thank you, huge thank you to Meagan for joining us and answering all those great questions. And thank you to everyone who joined us for tonight. We will be posting a recording of this webinar on the Surfrider Oregon YouTube page, and I will send out a link to all of the attendees as well. So if you want to watch it again, if you want to share it with your friends, please go ahead. And then I will also, in my follow-up email, I will share that website where you can find out more about Washaway Beach and the different projects that they have going on there. So thank you all.
Bye, everyone.